from the back of the ambulance into the emergency department, probably closer to 40, gets them to the bay and transferred over onto our bed where we can start our evaluation and resuscitation.
And before I go further, I want to ask you, Dr. Harrell, if you have ever been qualified as an expert in a court.
Not as an expert witness, no ma'am.
Okay. Your Honor, I would tender Dr. Harrell, based on his training and experience as an expert in the field of emergency medicine.
Without objection. You'll be so qualified. You'll be qualified for the first time then.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Harrell, so describe for the jury what you observed, what you first observed when the EMTs brought Officer Benner in.
The Rio Rancho Fire Rescue Unit that transported Officer Benner came around the corner, as is the normal course of action. We have to make a turn to come into the resuscitation bay. That was actually the first time that we knew that there was a law enforcement officer involved, and there was ongoing active CPR when they entered the emergency department. That clearly changed our dynamic in terms of how we approach this, not only because there was a law enforcement officer involved, but because there was active CPR. The crews very quickly gave a succinct summary of the events as to best that they could. We look for about a 15 to 30 second exchange of information, during which time we are immediately transferring the victim over to the emergency department stretcher, and at which point in time we do a very aggressive resuscitative approach combined with the surgery team, the trauma surgery team, to identify and treat and making interventions if there are ones that can be immediately fixed in the emergency department, in conjunction with gaining access if there is additional needs for blood products. The trauma team, along with the emergency medicine team, is making determinations about how aggressive and how invasive the resuscitation is going to be, making sure that we are appropriately able to breathe, pass air in and out through the lungs, the immediate kind of life threats. And clearly, an individual that arrives in the resuscitation bay with ongoing CPR, having suffered a gunshot wound, gets maximal interventions and focus from us in a very brief amount of time. And that is what happened that night.
And again, Doctor, because we're lay people, may be obvious to you, but can you explain why is that?
Certainly. For penetrating trauma injuries, there is oftentimes the possibility, if we can either address the blood loss or the injury that was suffered and caused the blood loss, that there's a time and an opportunity that we can restart the heart. Traumatic injury events typically have a finite time frame, and as the Rio Fire paramedics relayed to us, they're like, we immediately identified that we needed to leave the scene, which they did quite appropriately with Officer Benner, and a brief transport time from Rio Rancho to downtown, and the determination being made as quickly as possible that if there is a need for very aggressive resuscitation in the trauma bay, that the trauma service and the emergency medicine team will do that. The faster that we can restore a normal heartbeat and blood flowing around, either because of blood loss or because of an injury that's causing that, the more likely and the greater the survival chance that we have.
So after the EMTs brought Officer Benner in, excuse me, and they gave you, first of all, let me ask you that succinct description that you talked about that they gave you. Is that part of the training that you give the EMTs to be able to do that?
It is, yes ma'am.
And based on your opinion, based on your training, and not only as an emergency room doctor, but as training those types of individuals, did they give an appropriate, succinct description of what was going on?
To my recollection, they did, yes ma'am.
Okay. Now, Dr. Harrell, after the EMTs wheeled Officer Benner in, what was the next step?
The next step, working really in concert, it looks like chaos, but it is a well-choreographed approach to this. The emergency medicine team will take the initial, and we keep it simple. We follow the alphabet. So we make sure that we are appropriately able to breathe for the patient, whether that is an extra device that we place or if they're able to breathe on their own. We work through that. We look to make sure that if there is an immediately addressable issue with air moving inappropriately in and out of the lungs, that we do so. Do we have a pulse? So it's very simple. We've kept the alphabet as it is. So airway, breathing, and circulation. We already knew, given the very brief, succinct report, that the Rio paramedics did not have a palpable pulse, so they had appropriately started CPR. which we continued, and we immediately at that point in time for a penetrating traumatic injury attempt to gain very large access to the vasculature to replace the volume that we presume has been lost, and to also address, if need be, any injuries to the thoracic cavity or the abdominal cavity that we might be able to quickly make a temporizing intervention on in conjunction with our trauma surgical colleagues. And those were all happening very quickly within about the first 5 to 10 minutes.
Dr. Harrell, I want to show you what's been previously admitted as State's Exhibit 21.
Yes, ma'am?
Could you tell the jury, first of all, does that depict Officer Benner as he was the night you worked on him?
Yes, ma'am. That is the end of our resuscitative efforts.
Okay. And if you could, what is, you were talking about a thoracic intervention.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that what this is?
So what you're seeing there on the right side of Officer Benner's chest wall is a chest tube. There are two lungs.
Could you come down and probably do it better than I can?
Sure, sure.
Instead of me directing, you can drive the pen. And if you would, just try to direct your testimony to the jury.
Certainly. So ladies and gentlemen, what you have here on the right side of Officer Benner's chest wall is a chest tube. That is placed in the situations for penetrating thoracic trauma to see if we can immediately fix either a problem with too much air or too much blood in spaces where it should not be. That's the easiest way to describe that. A hole in the lung will allow air to leak out into one or the other sides of your chest cavity. As well, if you have accumulated a significant amount of blood volume that is leaking out of a damaged vascular structure, blood vessel or whatnot, or vein in your thoracic cavity, you can also have too much blood develop. The pressure from the air is most usually the immediate problem that we want to address. And in addition to a chest tube, there was likely a needle that was placed as a very quick means for us to see if we can relieve that pressure. This is on the right side of his chest. On the left side of his chest here, you can just barely make out what appears to be a very linear line here, and that is the end result of the emergency department thoracotomy that the trauma service will attempt in penetrating chest trauma. This is a very aggressive, very quick attempt to enter the thoracic cavity, and that happens on the left-hand side because that's where the predominant mass of the heart lies. So it actually doesn't lie center of the body; it lies over in the left-hand side. So while we were both placing a chest tube on the right to see if we could address additional air that was in the wrong spot and or blood, we were also having the trauma team enter with a thoracotomy on the left side to see if they could identify as well any injury to the lung on the left side or also to the heart or the great vessels that they could immediately address with either clamps, some sort of over-sewing very quickly, or even, as the case may be, sometimes direct pressure to it that will allow us to restore the lost blood volume and see if the heart will restart on its own.
And as part of your, I guess, assessment, did you also assess for any external wounds?
We did, yes, ma'am. I can point to what we have. We have the external findings here on Officer Benner's right shoulder. That is the end. It does not penetrate the skin, so this is the end of a track of one of the bullet wounds that we did find. There was another, having reviewed the OMI report, and you have this on you, there was another one in his left shoulder that tracks across his chest from front to back, top to bottom, left to right. That is not immediately identifiable, but there's a bruise that develops here in the right lower side of his chest wall. And then there is one on a right lower extremity, in addition to one here.
And this is State's Exhibit 22, previously admitted.
And this is a wound on the right, in essence, right over his right shoulder blade on the posterior aspect of his back that we noticed when we rolled him. And there is another wound that doesn't really show up well here that is just outside of the picture on his left shoulder.
Okay, you can go ahead and take the witness stand again. Thank you. So, Dr. Harrell, you described the thoracic, or the efforts to enter the thoracic cavity as thoracotomy?
Thoracotomy.
Thoracotomy.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And the purpose of that was, again, what was the purpose of that?
The purpose of that is to see if there's an identifiable wound with the bullet defects in the areas that we saw, and the reports from the paramedics. We were most concerned about a wound to his thoracic cavity, so in his chest, either involving his lungs or his heart. The trauma surgeons and the emergency medicine team make the determination that if there is a chance to fix one of those wounds, to actually in a very quick fashion identify, is there something, and it's really as simple as it sounds very complicated, but it could be someone's finger, it could be a couple of stitches, it could be something as straightforward as taking a large clamp and clamping across the large blood happened very quickly.
And in this case, in the case of Officer Benner, did the trauma team or your team in conjunction with that team, did you discover any repairable injuries?
We did not discover any repairable injuries. Unfortunately, due to the tract of the bullet wound across the thoracic cavity from the left shoulder to the right side of really his lower chest, upper abdomen, he had sustained injuries to the tip of his left lung, to the fibrous sac that surrounds his heart, to part of the heart itself, down through the right lung, and even lodging, I believe, into his liver. There was not an identifiable wound, unfortunately, given the devastating tract and the amount of trauma that could be repaired.
Okay. And Dr. Harrell, you were asked by the state to review a number of documents before you were formally interviewed. Do you recall that?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you recall what documents you in fact, or what items I should say that you reviewed?
Yes, ma'am. I reviewed a very lengthy lapel camera video from one of the Rio Rancho officers that responded, and the entirety of the resuscitative attempts that he observed during following his arrival on scene, up to and including the transport, the arrival and transport by Rio Rancho Fire of Officer Benner. I also reviewed the Office of the Medical Investigator's full findings from the pathology standpoint after their autopsy.
And given everything that you reviewed, including your examination of Dr. Benner that night, do you have an opinion as to whether or not Officer Benner could have been saved by any resuscitative efforts at the scene?
It is my opinion, from reviewing the lapel camera and the on-scene resuscitative attempts and his general appearance at the time of the arrival of the Rio Rancho officer, in combination with the report and the findings from the Rio Rancho fire units, as well as my experience and attempts that night, and the OMI pathology report, that he has sustained unsurvivable injuries at the time of his shooting.
And do you have any way of knowing, or can you estimate how quickly Officer Benner would have been incapacitated by the wound that you've described that led to his death?
It would have been quite rapid in onset, given the injury, particularly to the heart and the loss of blood flow being able to be pumped from the heart. We have a very small reserve during which we are able to maintain some blood pressure, but as soon as you lose blood flow and blood pressure to your brain, as we all know, we become unconscious. And that happened very rapidly for Officer Benner, given the extent of his injuries.
And you said you were able to review the lapel cam where it shows the efforts of some bystanders, witnesses. Was there anything that you saw that they did that was wrong or that might have precipitated his demise?
No, ma'am. The individuals, there was an Albuquerque ambulance paramedic that happened to be in the area that immediately identified that he needed attention. There was CPR started immediately, which in the brief time frame that you have in an hospital setting is probably the most important. And then they also attempted to place dressings to cover any wounds and stop any ongoing blood loss. I did not identify anything that was not inappropriate or the right thing to do given the circumstances.
So, Dr. Harrell, if you had been on the scene and let's just say you had your trauma team with you and you could have opened him up right then, do you believe, given the nature of his wounds, that he could have survived?
I would make the opinion that even there in front of a trauma team, that given the severity of his wounds, it would have been exceedingly difficult to keep him alive.
Can I have one moment?
You may.
We'll pass the witness. Thank you,
No
Dr. Harrell.
question. Can Dr. Hill be excused and released?
Yes, yes, Your Honor.
Dr. Hill, coming down, you may be.
Thank you, Your Honor.
State and calling next witness.
Steve Guerra, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let me show you in free take a seat. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and the bounty of law?
I do.
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Guerra.
Good morning.
Can you please state your name to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and please spell both your first and last name for the court reporter, please?
First name is Steve, S-T-E-V-E. Middle initial P as in Paul. Last name Guerra, G-U-E-R-R-A.
And Mr. Guerra, what is your occupation? What do you do?
I work for the New Mexico Department of Public Safety Forensic Laboratory located in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Okay, and how long have you been working at the Department of Public Safety?
Approximately 11 years.
Okay. And what currently is your title there at DPS, or do they have titles?
Yeah, yes we do. My title is a forensic scientist.
Okay. Now, prior to you working with the Department of Public Safety, do you have any former law enforcement experience?
Yes, I do.
And where was that, if you can explain it to the jury?
Back in 1977, I joined the Albuquerque Police Department as a police officer. That's when I started in law enforcement, and then went through the years and retired from there, from Albuquerque.
Okay, as part of an Albuquerque Police Department, did you start off in patrol, and did you move up, or how did that progress through the years of being with APD?
Yes, I started off in patrol, working graveyard shift, and then stayed out there for a while, for several years. I became interested in working crime scenes, so I started, took some training with the Albuquerque Police Department's crime laboratory in collecting evidence, documenting evidence, that kind of thing. And the job that I was trying to get was called a field investigator, which we would be dispatched to crime scenes from a burglary scene all the way up to maybe like armed robberies and sexual assault types cases.
Okay, and did you end up becoming involved with the crime scene? I mean, well, going back, you indicated that you were involved with crime scene investigation. Did you have any training in that area with APD?
Yes, I did. As a uniformed police officer, again, the Albuquerque Police Department Crime Lab offered a field investigator course, which was, I believe it was a 64-hour course in the identification, processing, and collecting physical evidence at crime scenes. That was my first introduction to that. And then I became a field investigator and stayed in that position for a couple of years.
Okay. At some point, did you join the Albuquerque Police Department Crime Lab?
Yes.
Okay. How did that come about?
There was a opening for the crime laboratory as a detective. I put in for it, went through some tests, was accepted into the laboratory, and I started my training in the latent fingerprint unit and also the major crime scene team of the Albuquerque Police Department.
Okay. And what type of training or courses, seminars did you have to attend as part of your APD crime lab duties?
Most of the training that I received at that point was in-house, trained by the other detectives that were in those areas working in the latent fingerprint unit and also the major crime scene team. So pretty much everything was on-the-job type training. They put on some more courses that I attended, a photo school that I attended to get more involved with the actual documentation of evidence in regards to major crime scenes, homicide scenes, officer-involved shootings, that kind of thing.
And did that require you at times to go out to the crime scene, or did you ever have occasion to investigate crime scenes while you were with APD?
Absolutely. Back then in those days, we pretty much wore two hats as a detective in the crime lab. We all had our specialties. At that point, my specialty was latent fingerprints, but we were also assigned to the major crime scene team, and we responded to major crime scene incidents to collect and process those type crime scenes.
Okay. Now, and how long were you with the, at any point with the crime scene, the crime lab of APD, other than latents, did you do other type of testing?
Yes, I did.
comparisons? Yeah.
Yes.
And what were they?
About a year later, there was an opening in the firearm and toolmark unit, and that's where I was selected to go in there, and my training in the area of firearm and tool marks and also footwear and tire print comparisons started at that point, and that was in 1984.
Okay, and how long were you with APD in that position?
In that position as a detective in the firearm and toolmark unit, I stayed in the unit for pretty much my entire career after that. During that period, I was promoted to the rank of sergeant, and which was very unusual at the time. They allowed me to stay in the firearm and toolmark unit in the crime laboratory and allow me to supervise the firearm and toolmark unit and a portion of the crime scene team.
Okay. And again, how long did you stay with APD in the crime lab unit?
It was probably about 21 years.
Okay. And how many cases would you say that you handled in that 21-year period, if you could remember?
In crime scene investigation, or?
Yes, crime scene investigation.
In crime scene investigation, hundreds of cases.
Okay, and what about within the crime lab itself, the latent and also the firearm and tool mark unit?
Probably close to 1,000 cases, I would imagine.
Okay. Now, coming with the Department of Public Safety, you indicated that you've been there approximately over 10 years?
Yes, about 11 years.
Okay. And what are your specific responsibilities there at, I'm going to use DPS, Department of Public Safety. What are your specific responsibilities there?
I'm assigned to the firearm and toolmark unit, and I also do footwear and tire print comparisons. So anything to do with firearms, usually we try to associate unknown specimens, either fired bullets or cartridge cases, back to a suspect firearm. That's our main duty that we do there. There are a lot of sub-disciplines that we do in the unit to include serial number restoration, tool mark comparisons, and also distance determination. We can do that there also.
Okay. And when you talk about, well, I'll get into that in a minute. Okay. What areas of training have you had while you've been with DPS?
When I went to work for DPS, I was already received a lot of training, obviously, with the Albuquerque Police Department. I was assigned to read all their literature, all their manuals at the DPS, and then before conducting casework, I had to pass a competency test in the area of firearm and tool marks and also footwear to start doing casework. I then did some supervised casework before I was allowed to do independent casework.
Okay. And what, if any, specialized training have you had in firearm and tool mark identification?
Well, it goes back to the Albuquerque Police Department. When I was there in 1984, I was assigned to a detective, Detective Rocky Stone, who was at that time a certified firearm tool mark instructor. The first course of study that I had to complete was the California Department of Justice Firearm and Tool Mark course. It was a course that the APD had adopted to train a new examiner. He also used the AFTE training manual, and AFTE is an acronym that stands for the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners. They've been around since 1969. They developed a training manual to train new examiners. So Detective Stone used that in my training. The majority of my training, which was a 2-year program, was working side by side with Detective Stone, showing me the disciplines, showing me how to do the examinations in this type of evidence, looking at firearms, looking at bullets, cartridge cases, anything associated with a firearm. In addition to that was the area of tool marks and also footwear and tire print comparisons.
When you talk about tool marks, what are we talking about?
When we talk about tool marks is really basically the umbrella, the large umbrella that encompasses firearms. Firearm is just another tool that creates tool marks on either fire cartridge cases or fire bullets. A lot of times when we talk about tool marks, we're referring to maybe like a pair of bolt cutters cutting off a padlock or something. That would be the tool. The tool is the bolt cutter, similar to the firearm, leaving marks on the cut padlock. But they all leave tool marks. So basically tool marks encompasses firearms. We just do more work with firearms.
Okay. And have you attended any conferences within your time with DPS, and approximately how many have you attended?
With DPS or altogether?
DPS.
With DPS, I've attended, I believe, 4 AFTE training seminars. AFTE puts on a yearly training seminar in different parts of the country. As a matter of fact, in 2013, we were able to host the conference here in Albuquerque. It was a co-host with the Albuquerque Police Department Crime Lab, and we had the conference here in Albuquerque. But I believe I've attended 4 conferences since then.
Okay. And first, are you required to be certified as a firearm expert at DPS?
No, we're not required to do that. It's voluntary.
Okay. Are you certified as a firearm expert?
AFTE started a certification program years ago, back in the 1990s, and I applied and took the written test back in the 90s and passed all 3 areas. And the 3 areas are firearms, tool marks, and gunshot residue. They had not developed the practical portion of the test yet, so I did not take that till later when I became certified when I went to work for DPS. In 2006, I became certified in the area of firearm and tool marks, and just recently in 2015, I certified in the area of gunshot residue also.
And how often do you have to take to be continued to be certified as a firearm expert?
To be certified, you have to do recert every 5 years. And so I've done that, and then, like I said, I picked up the gunshot residue certification in 2015.
Okay, and that, as you indicated, is not required, but you have volunteered and you've gone ahead with that process.
Yeah, I'm particularly proud of that because the last time I checked, there was only one of 38 firearm and tool mark examiners worldwide that are certified in all 3 disciplines, so I'm proud of that.
Now, and again, what happens if you don't maintain that certification?
They pull the certification, so it happens very quickly.
Okay, I mean, once you don't do it, they take you out.
There are requirements. You have to get so many training units per the 5-year block, and if you don't maintain those or get those, they will pull your certification. You also have to complete proficiency tests every year in those areas, every year for the 5-year period of certification.
Okay. Now, Mr. Guerra, what is your educational background?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Criminal Justice from Wayland Baptist University. I've attended, at the time, was TVI here locally, and a Criminal Justice Associate's degree in that.
Okay. And are you a member of any professional organization associated with firearm and tool mark identification?
I'm a member of AFTE. I've been a member of them since I think it was 1986. And I'm also a member of the International Association for Identification, which is more geared towards latent fingerprint discipline, but they also include firearm and tool marks in their area.
Do they require certification?
They have an area of certification in latent fingerprints and footwear comparisons, I believe.
Okay. And how many cases can you estimate that you work on a given year?
In which area?
Firearm and tool mark identification.
I'm guessing probably around 100, 150 cases, I would imagine.
Does that encompass gunpowder residue and all that, or is that separate and apart?
Gunshot residue cases don't come by very often. I've worked probably 4 of those in the last couple of years.
Okay. And are there any other duties you're required to perform at the state crime lab?
Not others that I've already mentioned.
You're not volunteering for any more?
I have enough on my plate. Thank you.
Okay. Can you indicate to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what is firearm and tool mark? I mean, what is firearm identification?
Firearm identification is a forensic science that deals with trying to make associations with either fired bullets and or cartridge cases to a suspect firearm. Looking at marks that are left on those items from being worked through the action, either fired by the bullets or fired from the barrel, or the cartridge casing being cycled through the action upon either firing or just working the action of the firearm.
And, Mr. Guerrero, what is, you talk about firearms, is there a part with ammunition?
Yes.
Okay, what is ammunition? I mean, we talk about ammunition all the time.
I've brought a demonstrative aid, if I could use that,
Can you
Your
use a
Honor.
demonstrative to explain to the jury? Yeah, okay. If you can stand up, Mr.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. I brought this large plastic cartridge. A lot of times, a lot of people think that this whole container, this whole item is the bullet. It's not the bullet. It is called a cartridge. The cartridge contains a bullet. This is the part that goes down the barrel of the firearm and leaves the firearm. The container that holds the bullet, it also holds gunpowder inside the cartridge case, and also there's what's called a primer at the rear of the head of the cartridge case. Altogether, when it's all together, it's called a cartridge. Now, people refer to it as ammunition or a round. Those kind of terms are also used. But the part that goes down the barrel is actually the bullet. The container is the cartridge case.
And they talk about also about jackets. What is a jacket when you're talking about ammunition?
When we're talking about the bullet portion of a cartridge, manufacturers can design different bullets in different ways. When we talk about a jacketing, what we're talking about, and I use this analogy of, remember what Tootsie Roll Pops are, the chocolate center and the candy coating on the outside? It's pretty much what a jacketed bullet is. Usually you have a center portion of lead and covered by a copper jacketing that fits over the lead. Sometimes they stay together, sometimes they come apart, they separate from each other. But that's what's called a jacket, the coating, the outside of a jacketed bullet. There are bullets that are solid lead, there are bullets that are solid other metals, but when we're talking about jacketed ammunition, we're talking about the ones that have a coating or covering of metal on top of it.
And is there a distinction in ammunition regarding hollow points? What is a hollow point?
A hollow point is just another bullet design, and it's designed to, well, let me back up. How a hollow point is made is usually there's a hole or an indentation in the nose of the bullet. The reason the manufacturers put that there is to make that bullet, when it strikes an object, to flatten out and what they call mushroom. In other words, pretty much double in size, because of that hollow, that indentation in there is allowed, when it strikes an object, starts to flatten out. It flattens out very easily. The other design for a hollow point is to keep the bullet inside of the target, so it doesn't exit the bullet, or exit the target. So it dumps all its energy inside the target. So that's what a hollow point is designed to do, to flatten out and mushroom, cause more damage as it makes its way through the item, and also retain in or stay in the item.
Okay. Now, let me kind of go, what makes, when you talk about firearm identification and tool mark identifications, what makes such identification possible?
Okay. When we take a firearm, we'll start with the barrel portion of a firearm. It's a machine part. A manufacturer will take a tube of metal, possibly, and they'll usually drill it to the caliber or to the diameter of bullet they intend to, or diameter of the cartridge they intend to make with that particular firearm. So they'll drill the hole. Let's say they're making a .357 barrel, .357 Magnum barrel. They'll drill the hole to approximately .357. They may also use what's called a reamer. It's basically a drill, but it just shaves a little fine more metal off inside that barrel. When these machining processes are taking place, that's what imparts the uniqueness to that barrel, that machining process. After they do that, then they go ahead and put the rifling in a barrel. Now, rifling is spiral grooves that are cut in the bore of the barrel to make that bullet spin. The reason that you want a bullet to spin is that it creates a gyroscopic effect on the bullet, allowing it to fly straighter and truer and it's more accurate. That's why those are there. So when they cut the grooves, you'll also have a raised portion in the interior of a barrel. That raised portion is what's called a land. So we have lands and grooves. You'll hear me referring a lot to lands and grooves. That's what I'm talking about. Now, a manufacturer, when he designs this barrel, he writes up blueprints to send to the machinist to build this barrel. So again, they're going to decide what caliber they're going to make. They're going to decide the number of lands and grooves they're going to put in that particular barrel, and he can put it anywhere from 2 to 15 or whatever he decides to put in that barrel of lands and grooves. They're also going to design the direction of twist, either right or left. Those type of characteristics are what we call class characteristics. So those are known characteristics that the manufacturer designed to put in that particular barrel that he's making. So two different manufacturers can rifle their barrels in the same fashion using those guidelines, if you will. The same caliber, the same number of lands and grooves, the same width of those lands and grooves. Those are what we call class characteristics. So if I get a bullet from a crime scene that has 6 lands and grooves, and the detective brings me a gun that has 8 lands and grooves, right then at that point, I know that there's no way that that bullet could have been fired by that gun because of the difference in those class characteristics. One has 8, one has 6. There's no way that it could be fired by that. So let's say he goes out and brings me another gun. Now this gun has 6 lands and grooves. They both twist in the same direction. The widths of those lands and grooves are the same approximate width. We know we're basically in the ballpark. They share those class characteristics. So at that point, I need to go to a microscopic level to try to make that association with that bullet, with that second gun that he brought me. But based on those class characteristics, that's what gets us in the ballpark.
Okay. Now, when you're looking at firearms and lands and grooves, do you document, photograph the evidence?
Yes.
And why would you do that?
Well, my examination of physical evidence starts at the very beginning when I receive the item from our evidence section. I'll go check it out from our evidence techs who have access to our evidence vault that we don't have access to. The chain of custody is documented in our computer system, so we can follow that piece of evidence all the way through the laboratory, and then when it returns back to the evidence custodian. So my documentation starts as soon as I receive it. I photograph the packaging to make sure it's sealed still and it's all intact. And then I also photograph the items that I'm going to examine. So all photography takes place from the minute I get it to the minute I start putting items on our microscope to do the comparison.
Okay, talking about that, Mr. Guerra, what type of equipment, or the crime lab itself, what is the process, the equipment that you use?
I use a number of different pieces of equipment. First of all, my camera, like I mentioned, I use very frequently. But we use a lot of hand tools. But our main tool that we use is our comparison microscope. What a comparison microscope is basically 2 microscopes in one that's connected by an optical bridge. So you can put one item on one side, it has 2 different stages on it, and another item on the other side, and you can look to the eyepieces and you can compare these 2 items side by side. You can move the stages either way, X and Y, up and down. You can manipulate the items very easily. The light sources are very easy to manipulate. Lighting is very critical in what we do to looking at these items. So again, it makes it very easy for me to compare 2 different items looking through that microscope.
Okay. And how much time, I guess, kind of a silly question, but how much time do you devote to the examination of firearm comparison and tool mark comparison?
Well, if I'm not doing a firearm and tool mart case, I'm doing a footwear case. So I'm doing one or the other. I'm doing a lot of work. Part of what we do is not only doing casework. We are required to keep up with our training, obviously, through the years. We're also required to take proficiency tests that test us and test the laboratory in our abilities to do these comparisons or do these examinations. We're required, and especially since I am certified in all three disciplines, I have to take those proficiency tests not only in the firearm unit, in the firearms section, but the tool mark section and also the gunshot residue section. So we're doing those in addition to doing casework.
Okay. And Mr. Guetta, have you ever testified as a firearm and tool mark identification expert?
Yes.
And approximately how many times and in what courts?
118 times, and in a lot of the district courts, judicial districts here in New Mexico, and also federal court.
And Your Honor, the state would move Steve Guetta as to be declared as an expert in the field of firearm and tool mart identification, comparison, and analysis.
Yeah, with no objection.
Thank you. Now, I think you talked a little bit about this, but what do the comparisons tell you when you do that? When you're doing a firearm comparisons, when you're looking at it, what does that tell you about the firearm as well as the evidence that you received?
What I'm trying to do, if working a typical case, a typical firearms case, it may have a bullet, may have a cartridge case involved. My goal is trying to see if there's any associations if that bullet or that cartridge case were fired by that particular firearm. That's what I'm trying to find out.
Okay, and can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what processes do you work? I mean, let's talk about the ammunition. When you get a case, are you attempting to try to get similar ammunition to compare with when you're test firing or anything of that nature?
When we do an examination, before we get to the test fire phase of test firing the firearm, we document, let's say, take that typical case like I was describing, one bullet, one cartridge case from a scene. We will fill out what we call worksheets. Basically, a worksheet is just a questionnaire notating the design of the bullet. We're talking about the bullet worksheet. Is it a jacketed bullet? Is it a hollow point bullet? We can weigh it. We look at the rifling on that particular bullet. We can measure the rifling. We can count the number of lands and grooves on that bullet. We put all those notes on that worksheet, on that bullet worksheet. On the cartridge case, we notate the same thing. On a cartridge case, however, there is usually information on the head of the cartridge case. It indicates the caliber of the cartridge case and also the manufacturer of the cartridge case. So that information will go on the worksheet too, the cartridge case worksheet. We also fill out a worksheet in regards to the firearm. Again, the worksheet just asks questions about the firearm, the brand, the model, the serial number, the caliber. All that information goes on that worksheet. We also describe the action type. Is it a revolver? Is it a semi-automatic pistol? What kind of safeties are on that particular pistol? All those characteristics of the firearm are notated on that worksheet. So those are the first things I do before I get around to test firing. When I'm getting close to test firing, I will dry fire the firearm. In other words, I cock it. I see if it functions normally like how I would expect when I'm putting live ammunition into it, and notate any defects possibly with it, anything like that, prior to test firing.
Okay. Mr. Guetta, in this particular case, did you have occasion to examine the evidence submitted to you by law enforcement in this case?
It was not submitted to me directly from law enforcement.
Okay. It came to DPS, but did it end up from your evidence locker? Did you obtain it?
In this particular case, my supervisor, Katerina Babcock, had checked out all the items in this case. She was tied up with something else, and I told her I would work the case. So I received the items from her directly.
Okay. And And you examined the evidence that was provided to you, and did you photograph that evidence?
Yes.
Okay. And why is that?
Again, I think I stated that I photographed the container, the packaging to see that it's still sealed. I also put my indicators, my identifiers on the containers, my initials, the case number, the date, that go on that container itself. We photograph that. I open the containers. I go ahead and photograph the items of evidence that are in the containers. Again, making notes all along the way.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been admitted as State's Exhibit 326. Is this one of the items you received in regard to this case?
Yes.
Okay. And is that your photograph?
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Now, inside that package, show you what's been marked as, or admitted as State's Exhibit 327. Is this what you received?
It appears to be yes.
Okay. If I could have Exhibit 423. Thank you. May I approach, Your Honor? Mr. Guerra, I hand you what's been admitted as 423. Does that appear to be the package that I showed you on the photograph, as well as the inside of that?
Yes, it is.
Okay. First of all, can you check to make sure that it's not chambered in any way or anything, safety purposes?
Yes, it's safe.
Okay. Now, can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what type of gun it is and the operation of that gun? Okay, if you can stand up.
Okay. This is a Beretta brand model M9 semi-automatic pistol. The action type of this is both double and single action. What that means is that when you load a magazine into the
Yes, go
when you load, if there's a magazine, I could.
ahead. Let me see which magazine. I think there is 474. Let me hand you what's been admitted as State's Exhibit 474. Let me get you something, and if you can recall that. Do you need any gloves, Mr. Guerra?
No.
Okay. If you can open that, that's one of the magazines that you had examined. That was provided to you.
Yes, there was a magazine and also some ammunition in here also.
Okay. If you can open it up. Is that the right exhibit first? I believe it's the
Actually, no. This is just contains ammunition, I believe.
Okay.
Or actually, this contains the cartridge cases.
Okay. Which exhibit is it? 481. Okay. I apologize. If you can put everything back. 481. I'm going to look at that in a minute. I'll hand you State's Exhibit 481. If you can open that, please.
And I do recognize this one also has my initials and date.
Okay.
on it.
Does that contain a magazine?
Yes, it does.
Is the magazine contain any live ammunition, first of all?
No, it does not.
Okay. Did you bring any, I guess, dummy ammunition, Mr. Guerra?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, is it possible, we can show the court that it is, can't be fired, dummy ammunition, in order to demonstrate this? Okay, good.
Excuse me. There's no primer, there's no gunpowder,
Okay. Now, with the magazine, Mr. Guerra, again, explain to the jury what you mean by that.
Again, these are dummy rounds too, just to show you there's no primer in any of these. There's no gunpowder. All it contains is the cartridge case and a bullet.
Mr. Guerra, can you come a little,
You bet.
is it possible to get on? Okay, come on. Let me just, and I can move this a little closer to you.
To make this gun ready to fire, what you do is take the magazine, which sometimes people call clips, but it's really a magazine. It's spring-loaded, and there's a part on the top that's called a follower that contains, it really holds that first cartridge in here. But what you do is take the appropriate ammunition, in this case 9mm Luger ammunition, and just load cartridges into the top. And they just stack one on top of each other. Just like that. Now this magazine holds up to 15. So when we say the firearms capacity, we always say 15 plus 1 because you can load one into the chamber, take the magazine back out, and what they call top off the magazine, put one more in there. So it'll hold a total of 16 in the firearm and magazine, but 15 in the magazine. So to get this firearm ready to fire, you take the loaded magazine, insert it into what we call the magazine well. You'll hear a click that locks it into there. Now at this point it's still not ready to fire because there's not a cartridge in the chamber of the firearm. So to get it ready to fire, what you do is just pull what we call on the slide portion. There's some serrated areas right here on the slide that allows you to grip it very easily. And just pull it back and let it go. Now that chambers a cartridge into the, or takes a cartridge and loads it into the chamber. So at this point, it's ready to fire. Now this pistol is what we call double action and single action. Now if you loaded it, you can see the hammer on this pistol is cocked back. It's ready to fire. But it has a feature in here that's called a decocker. So let's say you don't want to fire it at this point. You can see these safety levers, they made it for both right and left-handed persons, are on either side in the rear portion of the slide. This is kind of has two duties. It's a decocker and also the safety. So when I push it down, you see the hammer fall. There's a part inside this decocker that rotates in front of the hammer right before it falls. So that keeps the hammer from striking the firing pin. So it would not fire if I did that decocking mode. Okay. So at this point, now the safety is on. You don't see that orange dot anymore. So now that safety is on. So now it will not fire. It disengages the trigger. So now to get ready to fire, remember there's still a cartridge in the chamber. We flip the safety back off. Now you see the red dot. Now it can be fired from what we call a double action mode. In other words, all you have to do is pull the trigger, and you'll watch the hammer go back. So this kind of works like your old revolvers, the old double action revolvers. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. You just pull the trigger on that old double action revolver, the hammer will cock and fall, and the cylinder will rotate. You just keep pulling the trigger, like this. But on this particular pistol, once you fire that in the double action mode, now the firearm will cycle. So what happens is, and it happens obviously very fast, the slide goes to the rear. I'm going to lock it open for now. Slide goes to the rear. It will eject that fire cartridge case out. And then it will travel back forward again and recock the firearm. Now, at this stage of the firearm's functioning, it's in what we call single action mode. Now you can now you pull the trigger and it will still fire. But the trigger is now further back, there's an easier trigger pull, it's very easy to fire when it's in the single action mode. So the first shot will be double action, every subsequent, can't say that word. Every shot after that is going to be single action. Okay? So it will keep firing as long as you pull the trigger until it runs out of ammunition. On the last shot, that cartridge case, the fire cartridge will be ejected and the slide will lock back on the magazine. So it tells you, the shooter, that it's empty. Usually most guns do that. Sometimes in this particular gun, it did it on occasion. It would not lock back completely. It would fall forward. But anyway, that's how it's supposed to function.
Okay. Now, when you indicate, Mr. Guerra, trigger pull, what are we talking about? I mean, you talk about trigger pull. Did you do a trigger pull on this particular item?
Yes. When we're talking about trigger pull, we're talking about how much force it takes to pull the trigger. So this one has two trigger pulls. It has a double action trigger pull, which is a long, harder pull because it's cocking the hammer back too at the same time. So it takes more force, more pressure to cock that hammer back in the double action mode. Versus the single action mode, it takes a very light pressure. So it doesn't take much force at all. That's single action.
But is this we talk about revolvers, semi-automatic, automatic. What type of gun is this?
This is semi-automatic. In other words, to fire, you have to pull the trigger every time. Full automatic, you just keep the trigger depressed. It will keep cycling as long as you keep that trigger depressed and keep firing until you let the trigger go or until it runs out of ammunition. That's full automatic. But this is semi-automatic.
So every time it has to be fired, the person has to pull the trigger back.
You have to pull the trigger on every shot.
Okay.
Now again, the second shot after the first shot will be in the single action mode. Not unless you decock and do this, which is kind of odd. But every shot after the first shot is single action.
Okay. Now, Mr. Guerra, when a cartridge is in the chamber and the magazine is in the weapon, in the pistol, what happens when you go ahead and chamber it again?
Set this up.
You pull the slide back.
Yes. So I'm putting the magazine, the loaded magazine, back into the pistol. There's a round in the chamber. Okay, that's
Right.
so. If I was to go ahead and manually cycle it by pulling the slide back, it will eject that fired cartridge case back, or that unfired cartridge that was in there that I didn't fire, and then let it go again. Now it's reloaded again with another live cartridge. So if there's a cartridge in there, and I cycle it manually like that, it's going to spit out that live cartridge and not fire it.
Okay. Right behind you. Now, in your experience, Mr. Guerra, as a crime scene manager for APD, and now as an expert in firearm and tool mark identification, is that sometimes common where an individual will cock it back, even though there's a cartridge chamber already in a cartridge already in the chamber?
Yes, that happens. That can happen for sure.
Okay. Now, okay. Anything else as far as the weapon is concerned, Mr. Guerra?
Not at this time.
Okay. If you can have your seat. Thank you. Now, as part of your examination, I'm going to show you what's been admitted as State's Exhibit 328. You recognize, I think I better, let me see if I can get it. Can you get it better? Lighting, there we go. Let me just, okay. Did you take that photograph?
Yes, I did.
And why did you take that photograph?
Out of my routine examination of a firearm, I take a photograph of what we call the breech face of the firearm.
Can you show the,
I'm taking a photograph of this area right here where the firing pin protrudes out of the breech face. The breech face is that surrounding metal that supports the rear of the cartridge case. So,
you can come down, Mr. Gator.
or
Yeah, why don't you do it here better?
up where you
Yeah,
are?
right here,
Okay.
so you can use a pen. You can put the firearm on the Elmo too if you like.
this might be
Okay, and you can just turn to face the jury.
So right in this portion, in the center, you can see this hole right here. That you can barely see the tip of the firing pin that's sticking out here. So that's actually slightly recessed. So that's the firing pin. This area around here is what we call the breech face, and that supports that head of that cartridge case. Excuse me. So it supports this portion of the cartridge case while it's in the chamber. The other parts to take note is you can see this slight red painted part right here, this part right here. This is called the extractor. What the extractor does, that's what takes that cartridge case or cartridge out of the chamber after it's fired. So it basically is a claw that grips the rim of the cartridge case and draws it out of the firearm after it's fired, as it's cartridge case, or like the cartridge, like I ejected out here. That's what grabs that rim, that extractor. Directly across and slightly a little bit downward, this part right here, that's the ejector. And that's what kicks that cartridge case or cartridge out of the firearm. So all those parts come in contact with that cartridge case. They're machine parts, the firing pin, the breech face area, the extractor, ejector, and they leave marks also on the cartridge case that I can use to associate a cartridge case or cartridge back to a firearm.
So they're utilized to make a determination of whatever you have back to the firearm.
Yes, they can be.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead and have a seat. Well, go ahead. Let me, go ahead and stand, continue to stand, Mr. Gator. Show you what's data minute States Exhibit 329. Did you take this photograph, right? Am I, yeah, I guess it's like this, okay? And first of all, did you take that photograph?
Yes, I did.
And what was the significance of that photograph?
The reason I took this particular photograph is when I did my examination of the evidence cartridge cases and looking at, in particular, the firing pin impression, excuse me, Rob. Using this as an example, this dent right here in the primer would be the firing pin impression caused from the firing pin striking that soft primer area. So when I was examining the evidence cartridge cases, I saw this little indentation in that recess of that firing pin impression. So I was wondering what was causing that. And so I took the firearm apart and looked at the end of the firing pin. Oops. You can see this small defect, this small little dent, if you will, that's in the tip of the firing pin. That's probably caused by some damage or something that also showed up in the fire cartridge case.
Okay, thank you. And this is from the States Exhibit 423 that you were just showing.
Yes.
Now, you indicated that this was a semi-automatic. What brand is it again?
A Beretta.
Okay, 9mm. Is it a 9mm?
Yes,
Okay.
9mm Luger.
Okay. Now, with that identification, that's kind of an identification of the particular firearm. Did you use that when you were comparing the casings?
When I get around to doing my comparison, I told you I already said, I believe, I filled out a worksheet, and I had 4 cartridge cases. So I filled out a worksheet on all those 4 evidence cartridge cases, the unknowns, if you will. We'll take the firearm after we're done filling out all the paperwork and take it out using similar ammunition that was used, that I had, and test fire it. We have a water tank that we fire into. We can get fired bullets without too much damage on them, and the cartridge cases also. So I'll bring those cartridge cases, those known samples that I fired myself from the firearm, back into the laboratory and intercompare them with each other on the comparison microscope. So I'm going to look at usually the breech face area as a common area that we go to first of all, but then also the firing pin impression. And this one, the firing pin impression kind of caught my eye very quickly in that it showed that little defect at the bottom of the firing pin impression. So I intercompared those, and I started my comparison with the unknown cartridge cases.
Now, when you talk about test firing type of ammunition, you said you try to get similar. What do you mean by that? Why do you do that?
In the comparison phase, when we're comparing bullets and cartridge cases, it's best practice to use similar ammunition that what was used in the incident. If I have Federal brand ammunition that were the unknown cartridge cases, I'm not going to go try and choose Remington ammunition when I have Federal available. I'm going to use Federal brand ammunition. If the bullet is a hollow point, I'll try to use hollow points, but hollow points are kind of difficult to work with because, like I mentioned, when we shoot them into the water, they mushroom very severely sometimes, and they kind of obliterate themselves. So on occasion, we'll shoot what we call full metal jacket or ball ammunition that does not have the hollow point, trying to get good samples. But we routinely try to use similar ammunition that was used in the shooting incident because the difference in ammunition may make a difference and it may not. We just don't know, but we try to use the same ammunition that was used in the incident. It comes more into play when we're talking about the distance test.
Okay. Now to Exhibit 474 that you opened initially.
Okay.
I was ahead of my what does State's Exhibit 474 contain?
It contains 4 smaller boxes, or actually 5 smaller boxes. 4 of them contain a cartridge case and 1 contained a cartridge.
Okay. Now, in the cartridge, just the casings, what were they in your report? What were they marked as? G.
They were marked as G2, G3, G4, and G5.
And looking at the test, well, first of all, what type of cartridges are they?
They're Remington brand 9mm Luger caliber cartridge cases.
Okay. And all 4 of them?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in the magazine that we looked at, that you looked at initially, that I think you performed, you said a function with that particular magazine. Is that correct?
I received 2 magazines. This was one of the 2 that I received.
C1, the magazine that was, let me see where there's, I gotta look at my exhibit list. 477. Oh, you got it? Is that
No, I don't have it.
Okay. Yes. Okay.